Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of South Asia Research Center, Soka University, Japan, I warmly welcome you all to the symposium organized by SARC. I'm Ui Teramoto. I am a member of SARC and will be MC. Today we have a special symposium entitled to Women and Home in Tagore's Writing. It is a very interesting and important topic, so we have invited prominent professors today. Please allow me to introduce our guest panelists, speakers for today's event. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Professor Somdatta Mandal, who is our guest speaker today. Professor Mandal is a former professor of English and co-chairperson of Department of English, Vishwavarti Shantiniketan in India. She is a renowned scholar in English and has published numerous books and articles on contemporary fiction, culture studies, film, and diaspora studies. She's also enthusiastic in translating Bengali books into English and has translated more than 10 books, one of which is her recent publication, Kobi and Rani, Memoirs and Correspondences of Nirmal-Kumari Mahalanobiss and Rabindranath Tagore, that is published in 2020. Another book with another recent publication is The Last Days of Rabindranath Tagore in Memoirs, published in 2021. The former publication uncovered Tagore's travel to Europe in 1926, and the latter shows us Tagore's last 1 year after he fell ill from the perspective of female family members, which are the great contribution. It is our honor to welcome Professor Mandal here today with us. Thank you very much, Professor Mandal.
Thank you.
Next, I would like to warmly invite another speaker, Professor Mukesh Williams, who is an advisor to SARC and Professor of Humanities in the Faculty of Letters at Soka University, and also teaches at Keio University, Japan. Formerly taught at St. Stephen's College in India, he has published over 60 research papers, opinion pieces and editorials, 700 poems, being a poet himself, got an award from the UNESCO Poet in 2008, 15 short stories and 2 academic books, etc. And it is our honor to have him as a speaker today. We would like to first today hear from Professor Williams, who will speak on women and home in Tagore's writing, after which we would like to hear from Professor Somdatta Mandal. So without further ado, let's begin. Professor Williams, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. And Somdatta, if it is okay with you, can I begin with your permission? Please, please. Thank you. And Professor Joshi, namaste. Thank you for joining us. I am very happy to see wonderful people here today. I welcome all of you and thank you very much. I shall begin, and I am delighted to be presenting a paper on Tagore's Women and Home with my very dear friend Somdatta Mandal. She's a great scholar of Tagore, and it is my honor and privilege to be able to speak on the same platform with her. So thank you very much, Somdatta, for this opportunity. Today, I would talk about Tagore, Women and Home. And since the time is limited, I cannot touch upon everything, but nevertheless, I'll try to do my best. To begin with, Tagore saw women as a flame of the soul, not deities of household fire. This is a very famous line which practically everybody knows. But I wish to emphasize this. Women were seen by Tagore as a flame of the soul to indite, to create the universe. So we in India understood what he was trying to say. But women in America did not. This is the point I will be making. He got tired of their insensitivity and criticism. It has been said that Tagore was ahead of his times. He was against all oppressive status quo. He was against classroom education. He was against British rule. He was against male domination. And he was against women's oppression. He gave a very powerful voice to women through his stories, his essays, his plays, and his lectures. He portrayed women fighting social injustice. He portrayed the educated women fighting for human rights and for equality. And he portrayed women against widow remarriage, untouchability, caste, and patriarchy. These were eternal themes that we grew up with when we were young. Tagore portrayed 6 popular female characters in his writings. They show his understanding of female aspiration and their strength. These women are Mrinmoy, Mrinal, Charulata, Giribala, Kalyani, and Binodini. So I take up these 6 very briefly. Mrinmoy in Sampati is very tomboyish, a nature lover, and quite rebellious. She enjoys the company of a pet squirrel, Chorki, and loves to swing from branch of a tree on a moonlit night. Mrinal, in a wife's letter, rebels against the constraints of marriage and casteism. She takes refuge on an island and writes a letter to her husband detailing all the wrongs he has committed, including treating her as an object. Mrinal chooses her own goal to become a writer, rejecting authoritarian society and marriage. Charulata, very, very famous. Everybody knows Charulata. In a broken nest, awakens to her talent as a writer and singer. Married to a journalist, she falls in love with his brother Amal, who encourages her to write and to sing. Tagore empowers women to pursue their own destiny, independent from social constraints. Giribala, Manbhanjan, is a lonely wife, beaten and betrayed by her husband. While spying on her husband, she develops a love for the theater. She reinvents herself as Mandira Devi and becomes a successful actress, rejecting her husband once again. Kalyani, she's a fearless and rebellious woman. She speaks against British rule and against patriarchy. After her wedding is broken, she becomes free and pursues her goal. Binodini in Chokarbali becomes a widow at an early age and seeks love and passion. The story is not just about female sexuality and child marriage, but also about gender power and illiteracy. That's the point we have to keep in mind. Now, the main point that I want to emphasize today is the 6-page essay that Rabindranath Tagore wrote on women and home, which was written in 1922. It elevates women to the position of a goddess and imagines a mission for them to transform society. Tagore's style of writing is elevated and otherworldly. He went to America 5 times and stayed there for a total of 17 months. When he tried to convince his audience of the uniqueness of women, he was met with resistance. He was so keen to put his views forth that he refused to listen to his American audience and understand them. Remember, this is a time when the women's liberation movement was developing in America. That is 1916, 1917. Women were seeking equal rights, not the divine role of a devi. Tagore carried back many impressions from America, but he was never satisfied by the response from the American public. The almost mystical quality of his prose refuses to deal with specifics that the American public wanted to know, especially the question of how women should balance the role of an angel in the house and a social reformer in the world. Tagore was quite unclear on how women were expected to exercise a humanizing influence on a male-dominated utilitarian society and yet seek their independence. For Tagore, a woman is filled with boundless force, but restrained energy. She possesses the power to modulate emotion and give it a creative direction. She has a cadence of restraint, Tagore's phrase, cadence of restraint, that can turn poetic. She often guides the restless energy of men into any field of endeavor: literature, art, music, and religion. In Indian tradition, she is termed as Shakti, or the creative force. A woman may suffer biologically, but psychologically, she is the same as a man. If the world becomes male-dominated, Tagore tells us, it will become absurd. Therefore, women must not emulate men, must not follow or copy men. Life can become truthful and beautiful, not through sameness, but through harmony. Tagore goes on in this to talk about, Tagore gives a new spin to the biblical story of the banishment of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Eve, he says, secured the banishment of mankind from a ready-made paradise to create a self-made paradise. She became the energy to catapult mankind into a new world while Adam provided the wherewithal to build the paradise. So this is a time of self-reflection and self-reliance in America that Tagore also understood. Tagore laments the strategies used by Western women. They want to write off gender differences and campaign for equal rights in society. The desire to seek material and legal gains is a rebellion against necessity. He says, it's a rebellion against necessity. American women wanted to assert their identity in a new world order. Tagore predicted that this attempt will be disastrous. In this mad rush for equality, the divine concept of love will turn into a commodity. Tagore laments the crusade of Western women to become equal to men and remove gender differences. He sees this movement as a rebellion against necessity. The emotion of love, which is the centerpiece of man-woman relationship, must be based, Tagore says, on obligations. Tagore has presented an ideal condition for the Indian women. The Indian woman is seen as a goddess of love. Tagore tried to universalize this ideal in the 1920s. Spreading Indian spirituality in the West was looked upon with indulgence, never acceptance. This was true in the early decades of the 20th century in the United States. It is true in India in the 21st century as well. Women need their independence, Tagore said. Everyone appreciates it, but few will emulate it. Tagore explains that love must be based on obligations. Therefore, it must be reciprocal, give and take. Love connects women to their children and their homes. But when an injury or necessity happens, it forces partners to take undue advantage of each other. The emotional connection of love is lost. An exploitative relationship spells disaster. American women found social inequalities as both debilitating and contrary to their new aspirations. Men, on the contrary, are free from biological and psychological responsibilities. They could use the freedom to work outside and provide for security at home. The unequal freedom that both men and women enjoyed placed a heavy burden on women. Women tried to overcome inequality by reimagining physical and spiritual satisfaction as a kind of luxury. He used the word luxury. But an overdependence on sex and physical attraction led to human degradation. In ancient societies, where the pursuit of spiritual perfection was of paramount importance, women and their allurement were seen as an obstacle to realizing the goal. Tagore continues, the significance of the home forced men to accept their obligation. But today, the home is losing its center of gravity. The emergence of self-centered life is creating new luxuries. But this kind of life is tinged with arid zone of interpersonal relationships. It is very dry. Today, hotels are built on homes. It's a lovely phrase he uses. Hotels are built on homes, and men follow material goods like dogs, horses, pipes, guns, and gambling clubs. This is what they like. When women try to erase the distinction between the two sexes, they are expressing their suffering. Women lack freedom and at times turn their disabilities into attractions and make untruths into allies. Women followed the training they received in society to create harmony. This initiative, he says, lifts them from slavery into grace. It's very graceful. They want to become artists, not just artisans. But when women are not treated properly, they become insensitive and sensual. The outdated and barbaric traditions suppress women and make them economically helpless. He uses the phrase helpless. Both the powers of muscle and money can provide immediate satisfaction, but the sense of the ideal requires an infinite patience. The women of India, he says, are expressions of a divine ideal of love. They're often called a Devi, or a saintliness of love. The Eastern woman, he uses the phrase Eastern woman, is aware of the mission to educate men. Women have suffered, but they must keep their ideals and become like sunlight and a great creative force. Ancient women like Savitri conquered death through love, while Sita embraced sorrow through sacrifice. They maintained human relationships with high moral standards. They had risen above utilitarianism and acquired a very spiritual dimension, a very spiritual character. Tagore continues finally to end. He says, home is not an enclosure, but a moral idea. Home is not an enclosure, but a moral idea. It reveals truth, loyalty, and love. From the nomad to the cultivator, the home has harnessed the spirit of adventure. The nomadic life has also been predatory and exploitative, destroying homes and life. But whatever her condition was, a woman would not change into a man. She would always remain a guardian spirit. Tagore felt that women had a mission to restore the spiritual supremacy of life. Today, the question still haunts us: how a woman can be an angel at home and a humanizing force in society. So thank you very much for listening from Tagore's wonderful essay on women and home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Williams. I'm sure we have a lot of themes and topics to discuss, but I'd like to proceed to the next speaker, Professor Mandal, after which we will have a short session of question and answer. Meanwhile, I would like to request the participants please feel free to send us questions in the chat box. Next, I would like to invite Professor Mandal, who will talk about tradition versus modernity, the mirrored words of Tagore's women. Professor Mandal.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
And it's a great pleasure for me to be invited by Soka University, to serve in this wonderful panel, in this long-ending topic of Rabindranath Tagore and women. And as I have mentioned in my title, I call it Tradition versus Modernity, and the myriad worlds of Tagore's women. And here I must mention, by myriad worlds, I want to talk about two planes. One is Tagore's real physical relationships with women in his own household, and the same man writing about emancipated women, a lot that Mukesh has already pointed out. So it comes as a kind of a binary. That is what is most striking. Let me tell you a little. The Jorashako household was very, very, what should I say, modern in the sense his sister-in-law had made many, and the elder brother Satyendranath, who was the ICS at that time, he was the first man to venture women out from the Andarmahal, the threshold, outside the world, would go out, learn many things. So here was a radical, woman who, despite his father's dislikings, did what no one expected. She taught out ways to dress. She would go with her husband to the governor's meetings to meet British. So here he was seeing, as a young man, seeing this kind of a radical sister-in-law in the house. His own elder sister, Swarnakumari Devi, was a writer, and she would neglect her children. She would neglect in her even in-law household, come and live in the father's house to go on writing good deal. Now, the same man who had seen this, it is very difficult to imagine that he married someone who was much younger to him. Mrinalini Devi was not educated, from a very small village. It remains a query how this radical man who had been to England, who had seen the West, agreed to marry, according to his father's proposal, this young girl from the village who was hardly even educated at all, and stayed with him, with her, till her early death. The other interesting thing that you have to keep in mind is that all the three daughters that Tagore himself had were given off in child marriage. We are talking about the radical feminism in his works, but here was the same man who paid dowry for all the three sons-in-law to go abroad and get educated. But none of them worked. All three were failures. The first two daughters, who were married at the age of 10 and 13, they both suffered from tuberculosis and died. Tagore had to serve them. And the third youngest daughter, Meera, came away from an abusive husband and lived with her daughter and in Tagore's household till the last. So here was a domestic scenario of the typically, conservative, traditional household woman in his own household. And here was and we are surprised that this same man, on the other hand, when he took the pen to write down, he was creating so many, modernist women So much so that, you know, the question arises. I had written elsewhere, I asked a question that, was Tagore a feminist? And the answer is, well, he was a feminist, but not in the typical traditional Western sense. So this is what is the most surprising element which I'll be talking about. Another instance, before I get to the texts, to his own writing, was also seen in his family when one of the brother's sons, nephews, died at a very young age because he had been mentally disbalanced. And his young wife had been sent back to her mother's in-law home, her father's home, back in Allahabad, when they were supposed to be the progressive Brahmo Samaj family. So when the parents of this girl had arranged another marriage, because she was pretty young, it was the Tagore household who sent missives there. Rabindranath himself went, taking his father's permission, to stop that marriage. So this is the controversy in which many readers are not aware when they read the texts that he wrote, that here was this man who was, you know, juxtaposing very difficult traditions at home while trying to write about modernity in his works. This is what I really want to keep you in mind. So, at the outset, let me begin by stating that I don't have anything exceptionally new to offer. Like most scholars, enamored of Tagore's polyvalent personality, especially his treatment of women's characters in his novels and short stories, I asked the simple question, was Tagore a feminist? And like all readers, come to the conclusion that indeed he was one, but since he was much ahead of his times, he was neither accepted wholeheartedly as one by the intelligentsia of the times, nor could he resort to wholeheartedly sustain radical views in his female protagonists till the end in many of his novels and short stories. This resulted in compromises, in ambivalence, and ultimately in the dilution of strong feminist viewpoints. So when we talk about the stories of Tagore that profess strong feminist values and focus and also their representations in certain cinematic adaptations of the same. But before I go into details of the texts, let me point out or reiterate the basic tenets of feminism, what we mean by feminism. Now, we all know that feminism is both a political stance and a theory that focuses on gender as a subject of analysis when reading cultural practices and as a platform to demand equality, rights, and justice. Feminism's key assumption is that gender roles like a daughter or a mother are not natural, but they are social, because women had to be trained to think, talk, and act in particular ways that suit the role. Feminism's key political and theoretical stance professes the inequalities which exist between men and women, and that is not natural but social, not preordained but created by men so that they can retain the power. Religion, the family, education, arts, knowledge systems are all social and cultural structures that enables the perpetual reinforcement of this inequality. Now, why I say all this is to keep in mind the time, the period when Tagore was writing. When Rabindranath started writing creative fiction, the West was undergoing the first wave of feminism. That is from 1830 to 1920, with its suffragette and civil rights movements. Educated Indians, including Tagore, were not unaware of the new woman concept of the West. In India, the show had slow but unstoppable progress made in the field of women's education. The emergence of a small but not significant band of women writers, the Brahmo Samaj movement, and the increasing participation of women in the struggle for freedom further led to the increasing awareness that a man could perhaps no longer dominate over his wife to the extent that he so long took for granted. The desire for autonomy invariably began to percolate down to the level of familiar relationships. In Tagore's own household, the women of Thakurbari, as his ancestral residence is commonly known as, were all educated. Many of them, as I already mentioned, like his elder sister Sharala Devi and Sharno Kumari Devi, Sharla Devi, the niece, they were creative writers. Some adapted Western lifestyle selectively and were known for their excellence in the performing arts. However, the women of Tagore's household generally conformed to the traditional norms regarding marriage and fitted themselves into the expected roles of homemaker and caregiver as wife and daughter. This binary of being a free woman, but at the same time conforming to socially set stereotypical ones, often resulted in a dichotomy, which we find being adopted by Tagore in delineating many female protagonists of his novels and stories. The centuries-old conservatism in society, which dies hard against change, is attacked in his writings. So Tagore made extensive experiments with women's emancipation and sexual freedom in many of his novels and stories in order to express his views on the gender question. But the trend of his feminist ideas is not consistent or uniform. This is the most significant revelation that I want to draw your attention to. His feminist ideas move like a graph going up and down. Feminist ideas on the zenith and conservatism or traditionalism in the nadir. Writing at a time when patriarchal society was not liberal in conceding its women segment any right, any attempt at women's progress and or giving equal rights to women shook the society to its foundation. Tagore was not only naturally sensitized over the plight of women in Indian society, but he actually wanted to establish the individuality of women because it was individuality that ensured their dignity, self-respect, and sexual independence. The plight of women living in a marginalized state in a male-dominated patriarchal society is found in Tagore's earliest short stories published in different volumes of the anthologies titled Golpo Gucho. In Dena Pauna, the story, we see the trials and tribulations of a girl who has not brought sufficient dowry to her husband's home. The woman character in this story is very vocal. In a subsequent story called Hoimunti, the girl of the same name dies a slow death only after making a firm protest. The dowry issue is again the focus of Oporichito, another story published in 1912 as the earlier one. So in several other stories like Poila Nombor, Man Bhanjan, Boshtomi, and Strir Potro, Tagore creates the space for an unusual female protagonist, strong-willed, sensitive, moral, and independent woman who can challenge or question the dominant patriarchal ideology and pose an alternative notion of female subjectivity outside its prescriptive norm. In Poila Nombor, for example, the protagonist Onila finally leaves her husband, who, engrossed in his world of intellectual pursuits and male bonhomie, had taken her for granted. Her brief note to him saying, I quote, "I am leaving. Please do not try to look for me. You shall not find me even if you try." It comes to him as a shock and revelation. Far more intriguing is the knowledge that she had left an identical note for Sitangshu Mollik, the man who admired and worshipped her from a distance and was even willing to lay down his life for her. So rejection of both the lover and the husband. Again, the idea of a woman's right to choose her own path is elaborately reiterated in Strir Potro. Mukesh has already mentioned this story, and in this story, Tagore interrogated the system of arranged marriage and the entrapment and enslavement of women as wives. Though their husbands provide them shelter, security, and sustenance, all the three women portrayed in the story, Mrinal, Borobo, and Bindu, they have loveless marriages. But the obvious agenda of the story is precisely about eliminating the role model of the beautiful and submissive wife, Mejobo, and registering the birth of Mrinal. This metamorphosis of being a non-entity to a person conscious of her identity, of course, does not happen all on a sudden. Tagore constructs a very sensitive narrative in which he systematically records Mrinal's responses till she makes a decisive resolution not to return to her husband's home, which never became a home for her in the 15 years she lived there. I quote, this is a very famous quote from the story. I quote, "But I shall not return to 27 Makhon Boral Lane ever again. I saw what happened to Bindu. I have realized the position women have in this society. I don't want to go through it anymore." Unquote. This is what she actually writes. What is significant is the fact that having been married at the age of 12, this rejection comes through a letter written by a literate woman, beginning with the reverential Sri Charan Komoleshu. You know the way people addressed your revered lotus feet, and ending with the supreme self-assurance with Tomar Charanastal Asroy Chinno. That means free from the shelter beneath your feet. So, you know, the beginning and the end, see two different women emerging from the same root. So signed not as Mejobo, the second daughter of the household, but as Mrinal. It is obvious that her self-discovery is complete. Now, several critics, all of you might not be aware of this, that the journal Shobuj Patro was really the watershed in Tagore's concept of women's empowerment. We are all aware how after the publication of Strir Patro, it invited protest letters from the conservative segment of the public when it was published in the Sravon issue of Shobuj Patro in 1914. Bipin Chandra Pal's Mrinaler Patro, Lolit Chandra Bandopadhyay's Shamir Patro, and his anonymously written Strir Prokito Patro, published in the monthly journal Narayan, were not only scathingly critical of Tagore, but predicted chaos and doom in family and social life. According to the critic Nihar Ranjan Rai, this progressive and feminist outlook of Tagore, espousing women's emancipation, was not only the result of his personal thinking, but he was also imbibed from the progressive thinking of the West. He observes, the value of the woman is a comparatively recent discovery, the result of socio-economic evolution. This discovery was first made in Europe and many other Western countries at the beginning of the 19th century. But this discovery made its impact in the third and fourth decades of that century, and its full-fledged expression was observed after the First World War. Strir Patro was the first indication of the impact of that wave on our calm and unruffled shores. So Rabindranath had himself admitted that his short story was his first attempt in writing what he called a pro-woman text. And as he rightly pointed out by Tonika Sarkar in an article published in the Bengali magazine Desh, in a letter written on May 17, 1941, that is just a couple of months before his death, Tagore reiterated, and this is what he wrote in the letter. It's in my short story Strir Patro that I supported the woman's cause for the first time. Scholars and critics have often called the similarity between Mrinal's and Nora's predicament in Ibsen's A Doll's House. And there are many articles that have been written on that. In this context, it is worthwhile mentioning a reference given by Chitra Dev in her famous book, Thakur Barir Ondor Mohol, that means the inner house of Thakur Bari, that in 1927, this is an interesting observation, a little over a decade after the publication of Strir Patro, a niece of Tagore named Shushama toured America and delivered lectures. She was a married woman, a mother of 7 children, and her husband was a barrister. However, though she could speak in English and was aware of colonial culture, her personal responses regarding the position of women in India were so conventional and conservative when she stated that, I quote, the supreme traditional virtues of the Hindu woman are fidelity, sincerity, and self-sacrificing love. A wife subordinates her wish to those of her husband, unquote. Also, in a lecture hall in New York, Sushama spoke about the pride in Hindu culture, marriage, and marital relationship. This is what she said. Your idea of marriage, companionate marriage, and love seems very strange to us. Your divorces startle us. We believe in the holiness of marriage. Consider it as a sacred and divine union of 2 souls. Our marriages are regarded as permanent. Separation or divorce is unspeakable, and we stay married. So here, as I was telling you, the dichotomy and the period in which Tagore was trying to define these modern women this was the background that was taking place at the time. In Chokher Bali, Tagore's feminist stance takes a backseat to some extent. If we read his introduction, it becomes obvious that he had succumbed to societal pressures to present an ending to the novel, what he did. Though the personality and sexual independence of Binodini were the inevitable results of the 20th century concept of individualism, in the novel, Tagore had portrayed two contradictory personae of Binodini as a woman. She is a source of familial and societal good well-being, and she is also destructive. However, Tagore did not lower the Mohendro-Binodini relationship to the level of illicit sexuality, and on the other hand, kept the Bihari-Binodini relationship at the idealized Platonic level. Unlike Chokher Bali, Tagore was very progressive once again in portraying the triangular love of Bhupati, Charu, and Amol in his story Noshtonir, composed in the same time span. Again in Choturango, the novel 1915, he sought to strike a hard blow on the citadel of conservatism by bringing about widow remarriage. Damini, the young widow in this novel, is a rebel since the death of her husband, and the unsatiated desire of her body and mind expresses itself in rebellion. Here, Tagore not only has made a bold and decisive assault on the age-old conservative thinking by bringing about marriage between Sribilas and widowed Damini, but also gave the due importance to the individuality of a woman by prioritizing Shochish as the object of true love over Sribilas in the heart of Damini. That Damini rises above Binodini is proved by the fact that the question of society and public protest do not deter her from the path of marriage. When we come to Ghore Baire, 1916, The Home and the World, Tagore wants to live the life of a traditional Hindu woman according to the age-old Indian custom. But her husband Nikhilesh's expectations are of a strange, different sort. By taking her out into the world outside and allowing her sufficient independence, he wants to prove his own superiority and claim greater love for her. That she is thrown off the domestic fold under Sandeep's magnetic pull, and her infatuation for the outside has rendered Nikhilesh's home derelict and lifeless, is a different issue. The novel is in some way a triumph of patriarchy, but in the way Tagore highlights the pitfalls of Bimola's unsolicited empowerment. Through her, Tagore toys with the possibility that essential female nature is a potent and destructive sexuality. The highly troubled question that the novel seems to confront is not how Bimola can be liberated, but whether she can be liberated without dismantling the fundamental structures of society. As a full-fledged political novel, a narrative that was generated in the crisis of the time, Tagore's stance on the role of Bimola is closely connected with the idea of nationalism. Here, Tagore's critique of the cult of the mother goddess is also to be noted. Equating the nation with the mother as motherland is an old trope in cultural practices across the world. This equation has been a source of contention among feminists because, as they see it, it enables the male to control the woman and the country, even as this control masquerades as protection. In India, anti-colonial movements appropriated the woman as the boundary figure to be protected against the colonial male. If the nation is gendered, then nationalism is patriarchal, as the critic Partha Chatterjee had influentially argued. In Ghore Baire, emergent notions of female emancipation are inextricably woven into connecting ideas of nationalism, issues of gender identities, and those of sanctioned and transgressive love or desire. Just as the patriarchal voice is reverberated through the declaration, I will make Bimola one with my country, Bimola also clearly makes the woman's earnings for freedom in the world outside her home synonymous with the first that the nation is wanting to be released her from the shackles of foreign rule. When we come to Joga Jog, 1929, the novel, we find that Kumu has waged a lifelong battle against the stranglehold of patriarchy, even since her marriage. Though her battle against the loveless sex hunger of her husband becomes successful in the initial stages, ultimately Tagore chalks out a history of her surrender, however reluctant, to patriarchy as the unwritten laws of a male-dominated society. In fact, the end of the story can be taken as his sarcastic commentary on patriarchy itself. In the twilight years of his life, Tagore created the true modern woman, in fact, the Indian version of the new woman, in Shohini, in the short story Laboratory. Now, this story came out only a few months before he died. By uniting contradictory forces, Shohini is independent-minded, believes in women's empowerment, and is not averse to sexual plurality by virtue of a sexual freedom, and yet can stake her life for her husband's laboratory. She is convinced that she does not need to abide by the moral norms imposed by society. Thus, by uniting idealism and individualism, Sohini becomes Tagore's ideal woman. Ela in Charodhai, 4 chapters, 1934, is again a determinist who is averse to marriage in her early years so that she can chalk out a course of independent life. But while making an exploration of individual personality, Tagore makes her highly susceptible to love, showing love's irresistibility. From the discussion of some of the female protagonists of his fiction, it therefore becomes clear that Tagore's representation of women is preeminently feminist, a specialist in the post-Shobuj-Patro phase of his writings. Though he cannot be called a feminist by label, he has always advanced the light in matters related to women. And therefore, to conclude, we can say that seen from his fiction and also from their film adaptations, Tagore was definitely a feminist, but not of the traditional kind. All his female protagonists demand some sort of a space or domain, and this makes his stories suitable for exemplifying the woman question. His views were close to what the African-American writer Alice Walker terms as womanist. And we see that this is possibly why most of the film adaptations made from these stories, which have strong-willed women characters, have been so successful, be it Ghore Baire, be it Noshtonir, The Home and the World, The Broken Nest by Satyajit Ray, be it Strir Patro and Charodhai by others. So I think this intriguing character of a woman both inside the house and outside the house, and this Tagore's portraying them, as I mentioned earlier, as a graph. Sometimes it goes up and down, up and down. Sometimes he is a conservative person. In the next story, he becomes a radical feminist, again conservatism. And here I conclude by mentioning just one more incident. When Rituparna Ghosh, the Bengali film director, made the film Chokher Bali with Aishwarya Rai as Binodini, people criticized him for showing this young Bengali widow as a radical sexual, liberated person. And what Rituparna had to offer is very interesting. And he said he took his freewheeling stance because he read Tagore's declaration that ever since I wrote the end of Chokher Bali, I regret it. I did not want the novel to end like that, but I was forced under the social circumstances to make her like that. So taking this cue from the letter that I was not happy with the ending myself, I wanted her to be a liberated woman in the true sense. So Rituparna takes it as the launching pad for, diverting and making his Vinodini character to be, somewhat very much more liberal and sexually liberated. And in the end, she leaves and goes to Kashi, not to marry to anybody, but to live according to her own terms. So these are some of the, Tagore is very difficult to speak about in a short, limited period of time. But I hope I gave you a basic idea about, the kind of controversial attitudes that this great polymath writer had regarding women in his own life, personal life, and women he portrayed in his novels. I shall be happy to answer any questions or queries, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share some of my views about tradition versus modernity in Rabindranath Tagore's women.
Thank you very much, Professor Mandal, for sharing your great insight on the writings of Tagore on women. Though his relations with women, which were not completely free from the tradition and social norms of the period, we understood that he has influenced his protagonists and followers in spreading modern and liberal ideas through his writings. And Professor Mandal has shared with us a very important perspective, which we tend to overlook, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Professor Mandal. So now we would like to open to the floor for comments and questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself and let us know your comment and question, or if it is easier for you, please feel free to send us your comment, questions in the chat box. While waiting for, sure, sir, Professor Joshi has raised a hand.
Thank you very much for such a very illustrative and very brilliant and thought-provoking discussion on very thematic topic on women and home. It is something which the contemporary world is still struggling to strike a balance between the role of women at home and also outside, and finding a balance between the tradition, the norms, values, standards, beliefs, etc., and also that of the individual freedom. So, Madam, what I have seen here in Tagore's thoughts is that of, as many of you, both of you have already illustrated, the notion on Ghare Baire, where Bimala is really, struggling for liberation, equality, freedom, justice, power, dignity. And also what I have noticed in Rabindranath Tagore's thoughts are basically on boldness in his character. We can see that in Charulata. This is, I mean, consider that time and thinking of having an affair with brother, it is still, we can see how forethoughtful and how liberated the thoughts of Rabindranath Tagore's were. And also in Chokar Bali, he really gives some impetus on the, dictatorship of patriarchal society. These are very enlightening and of course, thought-provoking ideas. I'm really enlightened by the thoughts from Professor Mukesh sir and also Professor Madam Mandal's insights on women and home in Rabindranath Tagore's write-up. So I have two, basic concerns here. One for Madam Mandal. Madam, you have very illustratively highlighted on the thoughts on societal norms and also individual liberty. What we have noticed, Madam, in the contemporary world is that the social norms are also changing. So is there a corresponding change in the individual liberty? People, I mean, women, especially women, are looking for some sort of, individual liberty. In the name of seeking for more individual liberty, in some instances, what we have noticed, perhaps, Madam, I might be wrong, please correct me, some sort of, there is some change or some sort of aberrations in the social fabric, social norms, etc. Madam, just to give you an example on, polyamory kind of things and topless, then LGBTQ, etc. Perhaps those are not the thoughts during Rabindranath Tagore's time. So, Madam, here the concern is how do we reconcile between the changing societal norms and the changing in the more seeking for more individual liberty. And to Professor Mukesh Williams, sir, I can see that there are some clash of ideas between the Occidental and Oriental values, norms, beliefs, and standards, and etc. So is there any common ground or meeting points between these two, clash of ideas, clash of thoughts, clash of value system between the Oriental and the Occidental? I stop here, Madam. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to raise some concerns to very notable speakers. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much, Professor Joshi. So perhaps I'd like to direct the question first to Professor Somdatta Mandal, followed by Professor Williams, if that is all right. Professor Mandal?
Yes, as I've been telling you, when you ask the questions about the contemporary feminist issues and radical, we have to take the significant years at the time. I mentioned feminism not as a totally, genre that is found from the mid 20th century. Here, there were the early steps of, a woman having a right and a woman being equal to male and asking for her demands. This was, as I said, the first wave of feminism, of women not being the angel of the house. Now you have to remember once again the period and the time. Tagore went to Europe for the first time as a 17-year-old boy in 1878. And what he watched on the ships, the behavior of the Western women, that was the beginning. when he went to England for the first time, and he actually went and lived with his sister-in-law's family, whose brother-in-law, who was already training for the ICS there. So his view of the West, the woman, was ingrained in his mind right from, say, when he was growing, maturing into an adult. So this was, he was concerned, he knew about the West, but he was trying to, when he came back and he started writing, the stories I mentioned in my talk, I gave them actually according to a chronological development, you know, from the beginning of even the rigid societal reverberations of writing about a woman protesting against the husband and leaving the husband with a letter that I'm not coming back to your home once again. So for him to this balance, it's the, I think it's a very, the junction, the period in which he was writing all this, then the freedom movement, the Swadeshi movement, which is the backdrop of Ghare Baire, till I mentioned this, it's not a very good story, but a few couple of months in February, he wrote this short story, Laboratory. That was 1941. So from say 1878 to 1941, circumstantial evidences in his family and his imaginative creative writing, the woman underwent a great change. And if you see the story of Laboratory, the background of it, he was so skeptical about whom to invite. The story goes that in Shantiniketan, he was very skeptical whom to invite to listen to this new kind of story of the woman, and he was making changes in the invitation list. He used to read out the stories to the people around sitting in his house in Shantiniketan. But he was so mentally, you know, disturbed whether even in 1941 people would accept his story. So he went on making changes. This is the story goes that, you know, every time he went on throughout the day, from the morning till the afternoon, revised lists of whom he would invite and whom he would not, to listen to this kind of a radical woman's story. And the poor servant had to go on running about every time with new invitation letters and taking away the invitation letters of some people whom he thought would be criticizing him for at his old age for depicting such kind of a female. So this, you know, as you said, this had nothing to do, I said feminism, but it was woman's values. That is how we should treat it. It has nothing to do with Western feminism. But since also, as Mukesh has mentioned, being to the West so many times, he was also aware of, in England and in America, of what kind of liberty and freedom women were enjoying. And here he was trying in his own way to juxtapose the kind of situation that is available in India. So even if a woman, a wife wants to leave the house and not come back, is a very much more radical step that you find in Western women bra burning and taking liberty parades, etc. I think it is as radical as that, considering the time period. I think I am able to answer your question. It is very difficult. So from 1878 to 1941, so the big time span, women have been written about in different modes, sometimes supporting the conservatives, sometimes not. And what really intrigues me after studying Tagore all these years is how still we cannot read his stories without understanding what was going on with the women in his own domestic space, his own daughters, his wife, his in-laws, his sister-in-laws, and others. So here at this juncture, you should remember that the age of liberation offered by Brahmo Samaj, by the society, by women's education, by women's remarriage. And he accepted that to a certain extent, because you must be aware that he got Rothindranath, his own son, married to Pratima Devi, who was a widow. So here was a liberated man doing that. But this was a radical step, which he also tried to inculcate in some of his stories and novels. But in each, it's like, as I said, a polygraph. It goes up and down, up and down. It's not like a linear development towards feminism. Neither is it a going down back to tradition. He is constantly, and the vibes he gets from society, especially like Choker Bali, it came out in a serial in the magazine, and people stopped reading because they thought it was, too radical things. So at the societal pressure, he had to change it. And he wrote in the letter that I was forced to, it was not what I wanted to end life. So here was societal pressures also of still keeping the woman, well, you are radical, but you have to keep her still as a woman in the house. So this dichotomy remains in Tagore, and the time period and the contemporary historical social circumstances also, I think, are responsible for his attitude towards women.
Thank you, Professor Mandel. Next, Professor Williams, would you like to answer to Professor Joshi's second question, please?
Yeah, thank you. There are many things here, but the first and foremost, what Professor Joshi has mentioned, that the values, the clash of values between the Occident and the Orient, and can we have a common ground? Now, I think we should remember, Somdatta had mentioned the time frame. I would come to that a little later. An important point to keep in mind that before the First World War, it was impossible for values from the East to find a universal paradigm, because it was a very humanizing force. The Western set of values were very important, and the Eastern values were rejected completely. There was no window or space to enter. After the First World War, with the terrible atrocities that Western culture had inflicted on mankind, the Western norms and values were terribly destabilized. I mean, we can't expect you to think about humanity the way you have done what you've done. It created an opening for the spirituality of the East to enter. That is a very important point to keep in mind. Many scholars have talked about it. And this window is very important to present the Eastern values that were there in terms of idealism, spirituality, and to go against Western materialism. Take a look what you have done in the First World War. The other thing to keep in mind, that Somdatta has also mentioned this, that given the time frame, things in Tagore's writings undergo a change and new themes emerge. So from 1881 to 1897, this early time, he's talking about women fighting for social injustice. Then from 1893 to 1913, you have women fighting for human rights and equality. And then widow remarriage, untouchability, caste, patriarchy. Not that these issues were not there earlier, but there was a greater emphasis and a shift taking place from 1914 to 1941, as Somdatta mentioned about laboratory. So basically, we have to understand the shift that was taking place in his writing, depending on the time that things were moving. The other thing is that the connection between biography and literature. Somdatta mentioned with great detail the connection between biography and literature, and I think that is something that emerges in the 1980s or so, where people began to see that literature was directly connected to life. And this biographical approach, not what is being said, but who is saying, became very important. So this idea of evaluating literature per se as literature lost its authenticity. It is not the literary quality of a writer that was so important as the connection between how he lived life. Was there a connection? So literature has become a contentious area where biography is read into literature and evaluated. I am not critical of this method, but it is very much there. And this idea that how much we can read biography into literature or literature into biography is very important. Undoubtedly so. Writers are very, very sensitive, as Somdatta had mentioned, how to project a story. Many writers, from Hemingway to Proust and others, withheld their writing, especially Garden of Eden, Hemingway. After his death, it was published. It is about cross-dressing, transsexuality, all kinds of things. He did not think that it was okay in the environment of 1940 to write about these things. And Tagore was much more bold to write, and yet he relented and worried about it and, thought deeply. It has been an issue, what kind of reception there would be given the time, given the situation. And some writers take the advantage, are bold enough to write, and some withdraw and they do not write about it. And the stories are published after their death. So what I'm trying to say, you have mentioned about changing social norms. Now, I think that literature or the writing is always re-evaluated from time to time. It is never what the writer expects it to be, and rightly so. If Somdatta is talking about biography and literature, why not? And there was a time many writers felt that there was no connection between biography and literature. Today, there cannot be but a connection between biography and literature, because the inauthenticity of individuals seem to play a very important role in the kind of life that you lead. Are you talking authentically or not? Should literature be authentic or not is the key point. But because of the controversies that have plagued modern society, especially the Western societies, we begin to see biography as a very important component. So this is my general perspective. I wonder whether it helps, Professor Joshi, to I've answered your. I think Somdatta has definitely answered what she had to convey. Yes, Teramoto-sensei.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Williams. I wonder if there was any other questions from the floor. We haven't received any question in the chat box, but if there is any, please feel free to unmute yourself and tell us.
Thank you very much, Professor Mandel and Professor Williams. I'm deeply impressed with your lectures. And thank you very much, Williams Sensei. You talked about the difference between the biography and literature or literary text. I think it's very important. Thank you very much again. And I have a very simple question. We sometimes interpret or read literary texts as a historical document, and sometimes fictitious one. What do you think is the divide, or how we can tackle with the difference between the historical document and the fictitious one?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Kinoshita Sensei. Yes, the idea of Harold Bloom and Fish and other people come to my mind, and he said today, nobody wants to read a work of art, a fiction or a poem for pleasure anymore. We only read what kind of ideology is there. Is it truthful or not? Who is talking? So the contentious aspect makes you forget about sitting down quietly and enjoying a text. The text is ideological confirmation to fight ideological wars or to sustain and maintain departments. And he says, I really forget or really enjoy the idea of reading just for the sake of reading. So reading literature as a historical document is completely false. At which point a writer deviates from personal life or authenticity and creates imaginative event and comes back to reality, we don't know. There is a writer called Morris, and he once said that a scholar wrote about his story of growing up, Bildungsroman, and the writer said that the house that is mentioned in the story is the same house the writer lived in. And he shows in that house that there was a small boy who sits in a chicken coop and watches carriages go by. This is the same house. So the writer says that, really, is it the same house? He said, when I went to look at the house was there. The chicken coop was still there. There was no road. There was no road where carriages would go by. He says he was very surprised. How come? Why did he write this? Then he remembered that as a child, his family shifted to another house. Where carriages would go by, but there was no chicken coop. So he said, in my story, I brought together both the houses. He says, when I, as a writer, do not remember, how can a critic or a scholar remember that this is the house I lived in? It wasn't the house I lived in. Yes and no. So that is the problem with treating literature as a historical fact, and yet you cannot deny that history does percolate in literature. So how much of literature is there and how much of historical fact depends on the sensibility and the whole perspective of the writer, whether he or she wants to make it dominant or subordinate historical events. So I think a mature evaluation of a literary work has to be done very sensitively. And one should not just look for a one-to-one correspondence between history and artwork, or artwork and biography. So it has to be sensitive. And I think that is where the function of a literary scholar lies, how to evaluate. It's not a one-to-one correspondence.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sensei. I appreciate.
Thank you, Professor Williams. So, Ma'am, thank you very much for thought-provoking talk and discussion today, sir, Mukesh sir as well. I hope all of you had fully enjoyed today as much as I did. Before we end this session, we would like to announce you the upcoming conference organized by Salk University. As some of you may know, we will hold the third Salk International Conference on the New Human Family in South Asia, subtitled as Global and Local, to be held online from Soka University, Japan, on 26th November to 27th November. So if you are interested in, please send us your abstract, and we look forward to your participation. So this is the end of today's symposium. I would like to thank Professor Somdatta Mandal and Professor Mukesh Williams again. Thank you very much.
Can I say a word?
Sure, sir.
Yeah, I really enjoyed phenomenal research work on the biographical aspects. So I really thoroughly enjoyed and will pursue some of these directions that you had mentioned. So it was really,
and also, yes, and also I would like to suggest to the people who are interested to at least most of these stories have been made into films.
Right.
So if you can watch the film also, you know, cinema is a different art, no doubt, but watching the films also with subtitles, which is available now, instead of unable to read the actual Bangla texts, that also, especially the few important ones, Charulata, Strir Potro, Chokher Bali, Ghore Baire, all of them. So that would also enrich the idea, because you can visualize these women, the way they dress, the way they're, including laboratory, where we had the Hindi, because she was a Punjabi origin girl, and the director made Ravina Tandon as the heroine of, so that it might not be a great film, but also I think the visual medium helps for the less perceptive non-Bengali reader to, you know, understand this phenomena very much better. So that is another suggestion which I have, if possible. You know, videos are available, CDs are available. Watch some of these films. 3 or 4 of them are made by great masters, but some not very good. Even then, if you watch them, it gives you better understanding of the women, the way they dressed, the way they behaved, etc. And the juxtaposition of the different women in each story. Like in Ghore Baire, for example, you have this radical Bimola who has been asked by her husband to go outside the threshold. And she is constantly juxtaposed with the widowed, very pretty sister-in-law who stays inside the house, who is watching what is happening, what is gone wrong, and why is this, but who has no power to prevent Bimala from going out. So this juxtaposition of, in the same story, same household, of one traditional woman, you know, the widowed elder brother's wife, and here Bimola, So this happens in many places. Same also in Charulata, Nostonir, where she is having not a physical affair, but the involvement gradually becomes deeper and deeper with her brother-in-law because her husband cannot give her time, Charulata. He is too busy. And the last scene, which I must mention once again, if any of you have watched Satyajit Ray's brilliant film, in the end, after Amol has left and the realization comes to the husband that Charu has been missing his cousin, his brother a lot. In the end, he tries to make up, and without any single word, the film ends. This is, I must tell you, the film ends with here Bhupati, the husband, spreading out his hand to call his wife, come, we'll go together, to make a movement. And the hands come close to the screen, but they don't meet anymore. It stops when he raises out the hand to come. So this is signal enough to tell us that, well, the unity, the family unity is broken forever. The husband and the wife can never be finally reconciled. But without a single word, just the two hands come close to the screen and they don't hold each other. It freezes there. That is how the movie ends. And Charu says, "Thak, let it be." So that is enough signal. So to understand, I think, the intricacies of the development of the treating of women, Tagore's the adaptations made without going into whether it's a good adaptation or bad adaptation, but it gives us a brilliant more example to the, unique the personal as well as the fictional together in Tagore's representations of women. This is what I thought, that some of the films will make also a better understanding of this myriad, as I called it, the myriad minds of worlds of Tagore's women. Each one is different. Each woman is different. And with age, he had the maturity to understand that though you protest, you cannot protest leaving society alone. It is not like the radical Western feminists, how you become a protesting figure even within staying within the framework of the patriarchal household that was prevalent in India. Okay, I think I've spoken long enough on this, but I thought that watching some of these films might help you also to understand how the development or treatment of women in each different phase is different. You cannot put them all together under one big umbrella that this is Tagore's woman. In each one, there is a shade of difference. The handling of the story and the handling, and especially the ending of each story, while some in tragedy, while some in a kind of, you might not call it comedy, but at least a kind of adjustment with life takes place. But in most cases, they are outsiders. The radical women remain outsiders, whether it is Binodini in Chokher Bali, or whether it is Trir Patro, or whether it is Charulata, or whether it is Ela in Charodhai, who as a widow marries this revolutionary, and then she finds out that this is not her cup of tea. So it goes on like that. Thank you very much for giving me. I thought I must share these points with you. Over all these years studying with Tagore, we still feel, and having the advantage of being able to read the original Bengali texts also, even then we feel that we have touched the tip of the iceberg. There is such a lot more to be, read and understood.
And we are very fortunate to be able to read the translated books in English now. So Thank you very much, Professor Mandel, and thank you very much, Professor Williams, for tonight's symposium.